Welcome to Lesson 4 of Musing on God's Music. The title of this lesson is Conflicting Images. As we saw in the last lesson, our lives are ultimately driven by whatever we allow to shape our inner conception of blessedness. Whatever image you set before your eyes, whatever forms and shapes your path, will lead to your ultimate destiny. And as we read at the end of Psalm 1, the Lord knows the path or the way of the righteous, but the way of the wicked will perish. We saw in the last lesson that meditation upon the law of the Lord is necessary for this. The truly righteous person, the truly blessed person, delights in God's law, and in His law he meditates day and night. Meditation is slow formation. It is letting the Word of Christ dwell in you richly. And so the image-forming meditation on the Torah that is necessary for forming a proper path toward blessedness occurs when we muse on God's music, and that takes the form of songs. Poetry meant to be sung is the best way for this kind of slow formation to take place. And so this is why we need the Psalms. Inspired poetry does something unique in the formation of our biblical conception of blessedness, which fundamentally impacts how we live. Again, the difference between an ungodly person or a godly person is not that an ungodly person doesn't want to be blessed. The difference is that we have different conceptions of blessedness, which is why Psalm 1 commands us not to walk in their counsel, not to allow our image of blessedness to be shaped by an ungodly image of blessedness. Psalm 1 introduces that concept, but Psalm 2 actually then tells us what that ungodly image is. Psalm 2 opens, "Why do the nations rage and the peoples plot in vain?" This is describing the ungodly, the wicked conception of blessedness. Interestingly, the word for plot there, the people's plot in vain, is the same Hebrew word translated meditates in Psalm 1. Why do the nations rage and the peoples meditate on a vain thing? The old King James said, imagine. That's the concept. Why do they have a different conception, a vain conception of blessedness? So Psalm 2 is introducing us to the conception of blessedness that the wicked have, that we need to make sure that we are not walking in. Well, what is that ungodly image? What is that wicked conception? Verse 2 of Psalm 2 says, "The kings of the earth set themselves, and the rulers take counsel together against the Lord and against His anointed, saying, Let us burst their bonds apart and cast away their cords from us." Now notice that this conception of blessedness really doesn't have to do with their theology. They are not denying God here. They are not even denying that God is king. Rather, they are conceiving of God's rule differently than the biblical conception. They have a conception or an imagination of what God's rule is like that leads them to want to cast off the rule of God, cast off God's kingly reign. When they consider the rule of God, ungodly people, they imagine it as like bonds that need to be burst, as cords that need to be cut. That is the wicked, ungodly conception of blessedness. What is the godly conception of blessedness? Psalm 1 tells us, submitting to God's rule is like a flourishing tree. That's the contrast. God is ruler. That's a reality that nobody can escape. How you conceive of God's rule will shape your path differently along a different way that will lead to a different conception of blessedness. A righteous person conceives of the rule of God as something that will lead to flourishing like a tree. An ungodly person conceives of the rule of God as a bond that needs to be burst or a cord that needs to be cut. This is a contrast, two different conceptions of blessedness that really has existed throughout all human history. This was the problem in the garden. God promised blessing to Adam and Eve, happily submitting to his rule, but when Satan tempted Eve, he led Eve to conceive of the rule of God as a burden that needs to be burst, as a cord that needs to be cut, and therefore she submitted and did that. Or think about the Tower of Babel. After the flood, God had commanded Noah and his sons to be fruitful and multiply and increase greatly on the earth and multiply it. God wanted Noah and his family to spread across the face of the earth again for their prosperity, for their blessing. But we find in Genesis chapter 11, verse 4, that rather than seeing that as a blessing, submitting to God's rule was supposed to be a blessing, the people saw that as a cord that needed to be cut, as a burden that needed to be freed. In Genesis 11:4, they say, "Come, let us build ourselves a city and a tower with its top in the heavens, and let us make a name for ourselves, lest we be dispersed over the face of the whole earth." What God meant to be a blessing to humanity, they saw as a burden to be cast off. Or think about the Israelites. When God gave them his law, he gave it to them as a means toward blessedness. He said in Deuteronomy 28, "If you faithfully obey the voice of the Lord your God, being careful to do all of his commandments that I command you today, the Lord your God will set you high above all the nations of the earth, and all these blessings shall come upon you and overtake you if you obey the voice of the Lord your God." God's commandments for the people of Israel were meant to be the means by which they were to be blessed. But of course, the Israelites said, "That's burdensome. That's a cord that we need to cut. That's a burden that we need to cast off." And instead, they gave in to syncretism and idolatry. They wanted the good life, they wanted prosperity, but they conceived of that prosperity as a life out from under the rule of God instead of happily submitting to the rule of God. They imagined a vain thing. They meditated on an improper, unbiblical conception of what it truly means to be blessed. And this is true for all sinful humanity. Romans chapter 1 tells us that all people know that there is a God through what he has made, but they suppress that truth because they imagine that truth to be burdensome. So again, what Psalms 1 and 2 are setting is a structural framework that is developed through the rest of the Psalter. Two different conceptions of how blessedness relates to the rule of God. One that conceives of the rule of God as that which actually leads to blessedness. It's like a flourishing tree. But the other, the wicked imagination, conceiving of the rule of God as something that needs to be cast off. A perfect example of these contrasting conceptions of blessedness is found in the very death of the Son of God. As Psalm 2 tells us, the wicked, trying to cast off the rule of God, set themselves against Yahweh and against his anointed, against his Messiah. And of course, that's exactly what we see in the death of Christ and then in the persecution of his people. But in Acts chapter 4, the apostles encourage themselves in the midst of persecution by quoting from Psalm 2, recognizing that there are these two conceptions of blessedness, and also recognizing that true blessedness will be achieved when we simply follow along the path that God has formed for us, happily submitting to his rule. Because what we find in Psalm 2 is the biblical response, God's response to the wicked imagination of casting off his rule. What we find in Psalm 2 is he who sits in the heavens laughs. That image of sitting in the heavens is another royal image. This is communicating the kingly nature of God. God is king. And that is a theme that is developed through all the Psalms. We find images like scepter and kingdom and dominion and reign and rule, and even words like judge and even shepherd connoted to the people of Israel, the ruler of God's people. But what Psalm 2 tells us is that when people who are wicked conceive of his rule as something that needs to be cast off, when they set themselves against him, he merely laughs at them. But this is not a humorous laugh. This is a derisive laugh. He holds them into derision, he says. Then he will speak to them in his wrath and terrify them in his fury. In essence, what he is saying is, if you conceive of my rule as a bond that needs to be broken, then I will break you. If you conceive of my rule as a cord that needs to be cut, then I will punish you. You will actually reap the rewards of setting yourself against me. You set yourself against my anointed, you reject him, you arrest him, you put him on the cross. Psalm 2 says, you've simply done what I intended from the very beginning. I have set my king on Zion, my holy hill. You see, this is another theme that is emphasized over and over again in the Psalms and developed in the Psalms, and that is, even though the wicked are present, and even though they muse on different music, they have a different conception of blessedness, and even though it may seem at times like they are prospering, the destiny of the wicked is certain. They will be destroyed. Their fate is certain. In fact, although the wicked are present in all of the Psalms, most of the Psalms at least, they're far more present toward the beginning. And they begin to fade away, particularly in Book 5. When you get to the final 5 Psalms, the conclusion of the cantata, if you will, they continue to fade until you get to Psalm 150, and the wicked are no longer present at all, which is exactly what Psalm 1 promised. The wicked are like chaff that will simply be driven away by the wind. And that is poetically communicated even in the Psalms. Psalm 1:5 says, the wicked will not stand in the judgment, nor sinners in the congregation of the wicked. The last verse of Psalm 1, the Lord knows the way of the righteous, but the way of the wicked will perish. This is also something that is meant to be formed within us, because we might be tempted to be discouraged, we who walk along the righteous path toward blessedness. When we look around us and we see wickedness and it appears like the wicked are flourishing, we might be discouraged and tempted to follow their counsel. But one of the important elements that the Psalms are meant to form within us is the recognition that the way of the wicked will perish. Their destiny is certain. We don't try to ignore the reality of wickedness. We don't try to escape the reality of wickedness around us. Rather, we recognize it for what it is. We sing our way through the Psalms from songs of lament that properly recognize the reality of wickedness around us, with our goal being praise to the Lord, the Psalms of praise. And so Psalms 1 and 2 portray two conflicting images of the good life that are competing through world history, an image of a tree flourishing under the rule of God, or an image of God's rule that is oppressive and tyrannical. The counsel of the ungodly is that the only way to flourish is to cast off the rule of God. But what is the righteous counsel? Psalm 2, verse 10. Now therefore, O kings, be wise, be warned, O rulers of the earth. Serve the Lord with fear and rejoice with trembling. Kiss the Son, lest he be angry and you perish in the way, for his wrath is quickly kindled. Blessed are all who take refuge in him. Bookending Psalm 1 and Psalm 2 with this focus on blessedness. These first two Psalms lay out three important foundational principles that are then developed through the rest of the 5-movement cantata. 1, God is king. The Lord reigns. That's a reality you can't escape from. How you conceive of that reality will determine whether or not you are truly blessed. That's the first principle. The Lord reigns. The second principle is that the Lord has determined the destiny of the righteous and the wicked. That is certain. And that's something that is formed and shaped in us through the songs of the Psalter. And then number 3, Take refuge in the Lord. Happily submit to His rule. If that is what you do, if that is your conception of blessedness, then you will be properly blessed. You will reach and arrive at that goal of true blessedness in which we can praise the Lord with all of our being. By musing on these biblical foundations, our imaginations will be formed to conceive of blessedness as God intended, and then we will be truly blessed.